Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know how this works. We take a big stack of your reading and boil it down to the good stuff.
Pure gold.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
So today, we're diving into the God Delusion.
Ooh, Richard Dawkins.
By Richard Dawkins, yes. And we're looking at the excerpts that you all have chosen, which focus on arguments for and against the existence of God.
Big questions.
Big questions. Also, where religious feelings come from.
The roots of faith.
And morality of it all.
Right. Is religion a force for good or for bad?
Huh?
Or, both.
Buckle up, because Dawkins, as you may know, he doesn't mince words.
He does not hold back. You're right. He jumps right in and challenges this idea that religion is a sort of this progression,
Yeah.
You start with polytheism, many gods, and then you move to monotheism, one God.
Right. It's like a refinement.
Yeah, like it's an upgrade. But Dawkins says, well, hold on a minute. Is it really an upgrade?
He doesn't think so.
He's not so sure. He actually quotes Ibn Warraq, who said that monotheism is doomed to subtract one more god and become atheism.
Wow.
It's kind of a funny way to look at it,
Yeah,
right?
that's very witty.
He's poking fun at that idea that, monotheism is somehow the most evolved form of religion.
Right. So he doesn't waste any time. He's right into it. And then he also addresses this idea of noma.
Noma, yeah. Non-overlapping magisteria.
Which is the idea that science and religion kind of occupy these separate spheres of thought.
Yeah, like ships passing in the night. They're both out there, but they're not really interacting.
Right. They're not really in conflict.
Right.
But Dawkins argues that you can't really keep them separate because religion does make claims about the real world.
That's his point. Creation, miracles, the afterlife, these are all claims about how reality actually works.
Exactly.
And that brings it into direct conflict with science, which is also trying to understand how reality works.
Right. So they are in conflict. They can't be separate.
And to illustrate that point, he shares a pretty interesting anecdote about how some police officers reacted to his atheism.
Oh.
And let's just say it wasn't a very positive reaction.
So right away, we see that there's this societal bias.
Oh, absolutely. That Dawkins is picking up on.
Okay, so we've got Dawkins rejecting this idea of religious progress, this noma idea.
Right.
And then he goes for the jugular.
Yeah.
He starts tackling the big arguments for God's existence.
He lines them up and knocks them down one by one.
So first up, we've got Aquinas' famous proofs.
Ah, yes. The classic 5 ways.
Right.
But Dawkins says, hang on a second. Let's look at the logic here.
Yeah.
He dissects them and shows how they rely on assumptions that maybe aren't so solid.
Okay, interesting. What else?
Well, next he goes after the ontological argument.
Now remind me, what's that one again?
It's the idea that you can prove God exists just by thinking about the concept of God.
Oh.
Like, by definition, God has to exist because a perfect being must exist. But Dawkins uses this kind of funny comparison to show how ridiculous that logic is.
He compares it to a mathematical equation or something.
He's like, imagine trying to prove something in math just by defining it into existence. It just doesn't work that way.
That makes sense. You need some actual evidence.
Exactly.
Not just word games.
Right.
Okay, so Aquinas is down. The ontological argument bites the dust. What's next?
Okay, so then Dawkins tackles this idea of the argument from beauty.
Oh, yeah, the idea that the universe is so beautiful, so complex, it must have been designed.
Right. Like, look at this amazing world. There must be a designer behind it all.
Okay.
But Dawkins actually flips that argument on its head.
How does he do that?
He suggests that great art might actually suffer if artists were only allowed to create religious works.
So he's saying that limiting art to only religious themes would stifle creativity.
Precisely. He's suggesting that beauty and creativity can thrive even without a divine inspiration.
That's a pretty interesting thought.
It is. And then he moves on to the argument from personal experience.
Right, those moments when people feel a powerful connection to something greater than themselves.
Yeah, those experiences that can feel so real, so profound, that people take them as proof of a higher power.
Right.
But Dawkins, being Dawkins, compares those experiences to hallucinations.
Wow.
He's not saying that they're not real to the people experiencing them, but he's saying that just because something feels real doesn't automatically make it true.
I see. So he's saying feeling something strongly doesn't mean it's true.
Exactly. And he even gives examples of people who have heard voices or seen visions that were clearly not, divine intervention.
Right.
So he's urging us to be cautious about interpreting those personal experiences.
Okay, so we got personal experience. What about scripture? The Bible, the Quran, these religious texts?
Ah, yes. He definitely doesn't shy away from that one. He points out that scripture is not necessarily reliable historical evidence.
Right, it's not a history book.
Right. He says it's full of inconsistencies, agendas. You know, the authors had their own perspectives and they were writing for a specific purpose.
So we can't just take it literally.
Not necessarily, no. And he uses this really fascinating example about the story of Jesus' birth.
Okay.
The idea that the location might have been chosen to fulfill Old Testament prophecy, not because it was historically accurate.
So it's more about fitting a narrative.
Right. Which makes you think how much of what we read in Scripture is actual history versus, interpretations influenced by the people who wrote it.
It makes you question things, for sure.
And then, of course, he takes on Pascal's wager.
Ah, yes. The famous better safe than sorry argument.
Exactly. Like, if I believe in God and I'm wrong, no big deal. But if I don't believe and I'm wrong, I'm in big trouble.
Right. Eternal damnation.
Right. But Dawkins points out, well, hold on. With that logic, you could end up worshiping any number of gods just in case.
So why pick one god over another?
Exactly. It exposes the kind of arbitrariness of picking and choosing which god to believe in just to hedge your bets.
So he's really dismantling these arguments for God's existence one by one.
He is. He's not letting anything slide.
But then he shifts gears and dives into the evolutionary roots of religion.
Yes. And this is where things get really interesting. How do you explain something as seemingly irrational as religion in a world that's shaped by, natural selection?
Right. That's a good question. In a world where survival of the fittest is the rule, why would a belief system that often contradicts logic and evidence continue to exist?
Right. It's a puzzle. And Dawkins explores a few possible answers.
Oh, okay. Let's hear them.
So first, he considers whether religious beliefs actually offer any direct advantages.
Like helping people survive or reproduce.
Exactly. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, any trait that sticks around must be providing some kind of benefit, right?
Makes sense.
But Dawkins isn't entirely convinced by that argument, so he moves on to this idea of group selection.
What's that?
It's the idea that religion might benefit groups as a whole, even if it doesn't directly help individuals.
Yep.
He gives an example of, say, two warring tribes. One tribe has very strong religious beliefs, and they conquer the other tribe that's maybe more peaceful.
Okay, I see.
So in that scenario, religion, even if it's not beneficial to every single warrior, it helps the tribe survive and pass on its genes.
So it's like the survival of the fittest, but on a group level, not just an individual level.
Exactly. But he also explores another idea, this idea that religion might actually be a byproduct, like an accidental side effect of other evolved traits.
So not that it was directly selected for, but that it just kind of popped up along the way.
Yeah. Like a hitchhiker on the evolutionary train. He uses this really cool analogy of moths being drawn to artificial lights.
I like where this is going.
Right. Normally, moths navigate by the moon, but artificial lights mess them up. So this trait that's usually helpful can backfire in a new environment.
I see. So he's saying that religion might be a similar kind of thing?
Exactly. It could be a byproduct of our evolved psychology, maybe our tendency to see patterns, our capacity for imagination, our need for comfort. These traits would have been helpful in other contexts, but maybe led to religious beliefs as a side effect.
So not that religion itself is an adaptation, but it's piggybacking on other deeper traits that were shaped by evolution.
Exactly.
And then he introduces this concept of memes.
Ah, yes. Memes.
Which are these units of cultural transmission that, like genes, can go through natural selection.
Right. It's this idea that ideas can replicate and compete for survival just like genes do.
Okay, I get it.
And he suggests that religions might be collections of these memes spreading and evolving over time. So the specific details of religious belief, the rituals, the doctrines, the stories might all be shaped by this process of mimetic selection.
They spread because they resonate with our psychology or because they're really good at replicating themselves within a culture.
Exactly. They find a niche and they exploit it.
So Dawkins is really giving us a lot to chew on here.
He is. He's challenging us to think about religion in a completely different way.
And he's just getting started.
There's more to come.
So stay tuned. We'll be back with more from the God Delusion.
We'll be diving deeper into Dawkins' critique of religion and his vision for a world without God.
It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah.
Don't miss it.
So we've seen how Dawkins tackles those arguments for God, but now he shifts gears a bit.
Yeah. Where's he going next?
He wants to talk about what he calls the dark side of religion.
Ooh, okay. So he's not pulling any punches here.
Not at all. He points out how religion can be used to justify some pretty terrible things. Violence, cruelty, you name it.
Both in the past and in the present.
Exactly. He brings up those, really disturbing accounts of genocide in the Old Testament.
Right.
And he compares them to, modern day examples of religious extremism and terrorism.
It's a pretty stark comparison.
It is. And, what's interesting is he's not just focusing on those extreme cases.
What do you mean?
He argues that maybe the problem lies with the nature of faith itself.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, he says that because faith allows people to believe things without needing evidence, it can be really easily manipulated.
I see what you mean.
Twisted to justify all sorts of harmful acts.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And one of the things that really stuck with me from the book was his discussion of childhood indoctrination.
Yeah, he's really critical of how kids are raised within these religious frameworks before they can even understand what it all means.
It was like, they're not really given a choice. They're just kind of born into it.
Right. They're not old enough to really question it or make their own decisions.
Exactly. And he sees that as really problematic. He even goes so far as to say that it could be considered a form of child abuse.
Wow. Okay. Strong words.
Yeah. He shares this really heartbreaking story about Edgardo Mortara. He was a Jewish child who was taken from his family and raised Catholic because he had been secretly baptized as a baby.
Oh my gosh.
I know. It's a really disturbing example of how religious absolutism can have these, truly devastating consequences.
It's scary to think about.
It is. And he also criticizes this common practice of labeling children by religion, like calling them a Catholic child or a Muslim child.
Right, before they even know what those labels mean.
Yeah. It all goes back to that indoctrination idea, shaping a child's identity before they've even had a chance to think for themselves.
And he argues that this early exposure can have a really profound impact on how they see the world.
Absolutely. It can shape their whole worldview. And, one of the things he's particularly concerned about is the fear and guilt that can be instilled through religious teachings.
Especially, I imagine, the concept of hell.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. That idea that if you don't believe the right things, you're going to be punished eternally.
That's pretty heavy stuff for a young mind to grapple with.
Yeah, it is. But here's what I found really interesting. Even though Dawkins is so critical of religion, he really emphasizes that life without God can be full of meaning and wonder.
So he's not advocating for nihilism or despair.
Not at all. In fact, he sees atheism as a really liberating and empowering thing.
Oh, okay, I see.
He finds inspiration in things like science, the vastness of the universe, the incredible complexity of life on Earth.
Those are pretty amazing things to contemplate.
They are, and he uses this really beautiful metaphor to kind of illustrate our place in the grand scheme of things.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
He asks us to imagine this tiny spotlight creeping across a giant ruler that represents all of time.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And that spotlight represents our existence, just this brief flash in the immensity of time.
So he's emphasizing how precious and fleeting life is.
Yeah, and how lucky we are to be alive at all. And he encourages us to embrace this limited time we have and to appreciate the natural world without needing these supernatural explanations.
That's a powerful way of looking at things.
It is, and it speaks to one of the core themes of the book, I think, this idea that meaning and purpose aren't something that's given to us from on high.
We have to create them ourselves.
Exactly. Through our actions, our experiences, our relationships.
So Dawkins is challenging us to find that meaning and purpose outside of religion.
He is. And he doesn't really lay out a step-by-step guide, but he encourages us to explore with an open mind.
To embrace curiosity, critical thinking, a deep appreciation for the natural world.
Exactly. And he suggests looking to things like science, art, literature, human connection, as sources of inspiration.
It's about recognizing the beauty and fragility of our existence and making the most of the time we have.
Exactly. And a key part of that for Dawkins is fostering that same sense of wonder and critical thinking in the next generation.
Yeah, he's really big on that. He says that instead of indoctrinating children into a specific belief system, we should be empowering them to question everything.
To explore, to form their own conclusions based on reason and evidence.
So the God Delusion is more than just a critique of religion. It's a call for a more rational, evidence-based approach to understanding the world.
And to finding meaning and purpose in our shared humanity and our connection to the natural world.
It sounds like a pretty thought-provoking read.
It is. One of those books that really makes you think and challenges your perspectives.
It feels like Dawkins is really pushing us towards this different way of looking at the world, finding meaning and purpose without relying on traditional religious beliefs. But what does that actually look like? How do we do that?
Well, I think that's where the real work begins. It's about actively seeking out those sources of inspiration and wonder in the world around us. And Dawkins points to science as one really powerful avenue for that.
Okay, yeah.
Understanding, the intricacies of the universe and the natural world can be deeply awe-inspiring.
Yeah, it's like that feeling you get when you look up at the night sky and you realize just how vast and ancient the universe is.
Exactly. Or when you learn about the incredible complexity of a single cell.
Yeah, for sure.
It's mind-blowing. And, Dawkins doesn't limit himself to science either.
Oh.
He also talks about art, literature, music, human connection. All these things can be sources of meaning. It's about finding what resonates with you personally.
So finding those things that connect you to something bigger than yourself.
Right, exactly.
But outside of, a religious framework.
Exactly.
And he also seems to be saying that true fulfillment comes from, embracing our shared humanity and finding ways to contribute to the world in a positive way.
Absolutely. Making a difference, leaving the world a little bit better than we found it. And you know what else he challenges us to rethink?
What's that?
Our relationship with mortality.
Oh, okay.
Instead of fearing death, he actually suggests that acknowledging the finite nature of our existence can make life more meaningful.
Because it kind of forces us to focus on the here and now.
Right, exactly. It motivates us to make the most of the time we have and to really cherish our experiences.
It's like, instead of worrying about what happens after we die, we focus on living a really full and meaningful life right now.
Exactly. And a key part of that for Dawkins is fostering that same sense of wonder and critical thinking in the next generation.
Oh, yeah, he's really passionate about that.
He believes that instead of indoctrinating children into a particular belief system, we should be empowering them to question, explore, and form their own conclusions.
Based on, reason and evidence.
Exactly.
So it sounds like the God Delusion is more than just a critique of religion. It's almost like a call to action.
It is. It's a challenge to, really examine our assumptions and embrace a more rational and compassionate worldview, and to create a more meaningful life for ourselves and for future generations.
It's definitely a book that will make you think.
Oh, yeah. Challenge your perspectives.
Spark some really interesting conversations.
Yeah.
So if you're ready for that, if you're ready to really dive deep into these ideas, we highly recommend picking up a copy of The God Delusion for yourself. You'll find a link to purchase the book in the show notes.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of these fascinating topics. We're always, diving into new and challenging subjects, and we'd love for you to join us on that journey.
And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend who might appreciate a good intellectual workout. Until next time, keep those minds engaged.